Hi. All right. So today we are going to talk about the skills of a historian and what are the vital skills that we need when we are studying history. So, the ones that we are going to focus on today are primary and secondary sources and how to evaluate what the right source is, not only in terms of bias and its accuracy, but also what is the best type of source to use based on the historical question we're asking. So, let's take a look. Primary and secondary sources. Hopefully, this is a review for you guys, but just in case it's not, primary and secondary sources. I should move the little video. Can I move this? There we go. We'll try it over here. Primary and secondary sources, when used together, help us understand people, ideas, and events from the past. But we always want to use them together, right? We can't use just a primary source and we can't use just a secondary source. Libraries, archives, and now the internet hold objects or documents, um, articles, resources, pictures at least of them that help us find out what happened in the past. And we divide these things into primary and secondary sources. So let's take a look at primary. Primary sources are the earliest or the original source. So a primary source was created at the time of an event or very soon after something happened. These accounts are called primary sources because they're the first evidence of something happening. So, examples of that are people who were at an event writing about the event. People who, and they could write about it 5 years later, but as long as they were present at that event, then their account of that event is a primary source. So, some examples: diaries, letters. So, the diary of someone who is living through COVID, is living through the pandemic right now. That would be an example of a primary source. A letter from, let's say, a World War II soldier writes a letter to his wife and children back home about what life is like in the trenches. That would be World War I, but you get the idea. Like, that's a primary source. Photographs. Photographs date as far back as the Civil War now. So a photograph of an event is a primary source because it's something that captured that moment in time. Maps, video. Now, video is a tricky one. Video and film. Primary source can be video, but it has to be the original video. So a documentary would not be a primary source. However, a primary source such as like news footage from September 11th would absolutely be a primary source because it's footage of something that was happening in that moment, not someone going back and analyzing the footage, if that makes sense. Speeches would also be one. So like Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech would be a primary source. Secondary sources are next in place or time, meaning that secondary sources are created after primary sources. We create secondary sources by using primary sources to inform us. So historians look at primary sources and then they create something based off of that. They create an analysis of the event. Okay. They can give additional opinions on the past event, or on the primary source itself. These are documentaries, textbooks, biographies, right? An autobiography would be a primary source, but a biography is a story about someone written by someone else. So that's a secondary source. Movies of historical events, so like the movie Troy, is that going to be the best historical source to use? No. But is it a secondary source? Yes. Scholarly articles, websites such as history.com would be an excellent one to use for scholarly research. Now, with any source, you have to keep in mind bias. What is bias? And I know you've all probably heard that word, but what does it mean? So, since history is objective, since history is kind of objective, meaning we're going to interpret it differently. But since history is a subject where people express their opinions, it means that we have to be very careful to watch out for bias. Bias is our own opinions influencing how we interpret and explain the events. So every source has bias, okay? Whether it is a secondary source or a primary source, both are full of bias. It just depends on the type of bias. So a primary source is going to have an extreme amount of bias because it is written from someone's perspective. Primary tends to contain more because it's written from their personal point of view. Secondary would have bias because, for example, a textbook. Textbooks are written by companies. We are all full of bias. So the person writing that story, the person doing the analysis, is going to have their bias is going to come through naturally in a secondary source. However, secondary sources tend to be less biased than primary because they are not the personal perspective of someone who experienced the event. Okay. Does that mean that primary sources shouldn't be used or that secondary should always be used above primary? Absolutely not. All right. That's when you have to get into evaluating what is the best source to use. And typically we want to use a combination of primary and secondary sources. So if I was looking at wanting to study the Hellenistic cultural diffusion of Alexander's empire, I would want to look at the primary source accounts of the people that he conquered. So Macedonia, Egypt, Persia, the Greeks. I'd want to look at first person perspectives, historical documents that tell me a little bit about what each group was thinking, feeling, experiencing. But then I'd also want to use a secondary source, like my textbook, like a scholarly article, to tell me about the broader impacts that Alexander's empire had on the Hellenistic world. And Hellenistic just means Greek. But what are the broader impacts that he had in that moment, but over time, and what are we still seeing? So in order to get the full picture, I need to use multiple sources. All right, when trying to think, is something primary, is something secondary, we have this checklist that you can use. So, keep having to move the video. So primary sources, and if you want to copy this down, go ahead. It's probably handy to have, or if you take a screenshot and save it. But here's a checklist to help you think, is this a primary source or a secondary source? Primary sources were created at the time of the event or very soon after. They are created by someone who saw or heard an event themselves, or it is an object that was present at that event. So a piece of pottery, a piece of architecture, ancient ruins of Rome, those are primary sources still. And they tell us kind of how people lived, how they built things, what tools they used, but it is still a source. They are one of a kind, they are rare. Now, a letter itself is not rare, but no two letters are going to be the same. The guy experiencing the trenches of World War I in France is going to be different than the guy in Germany experiencing the same thing. Both are valid sources, but they are different letters. Diaries, letters, photos, newspapers, things that were there. Secondary sources were created after, sometimes a long time after. So when you write a paper about something, you are creating a secondary source. It is your opinion. You are using primary sources and other secondary sources to inform you. It expresses an opinion or an argument about a past event. So it's an analysis. Opinion sometimes makes you feel like it's full of bias. And secondary sources, like I said, have bias. But it is an analysis of the event. It is us looking at history critically and coming to a conclusion. But we weren't there, so we can't say with exact certainty exactly how it happened, but how we're interpreting it. Often they use primary sources as examples, and they use primary sources to help inform them. Textbooks, biographies, documentaries, movies. All right, so a primary source, we're going to use September 11th as an example. Primary sources would be news footage from CNN, an article from the New York Times, pictures that people have taken, an oral history, meaning like talking to someone who was present at Ground Zero, who was present in New York on the day, talking to someone who was even just alive during that time. So if you talk to your parents about September 11th and, hey, what was it like for you? That's still a primary source. If I want to know what life was like or what it was like to be there at the attack, then you'd want to talk to a survivor of ground zero, like from ground zero, who was there. But both are primary sources just for different historical questions. There is a lot of footage of 9/11, as we all know. So you also have to be careful in today's day and age when you're looking at footage that you are looking at the actual footage and not something that's been doctored. Unfortunately, that is something we have to look at in today's world. But using sources like CNN, NBC, news stations that were broadcasting at the time of the attack helps you understand the validity of it. A secondary source, okay? Because a YouTube clip from the Today Show, which was streaming live on September 11th, that's a primary source. But the documentaries that came after, Fahrenheit 9/11, Myths and Facts About 9/11, The Nation 10 Years Later, a speech given by President Obama in Shanksville, Pennsylvania to commemorate the 15-year anniversary. Any of that would be a secondary source for 9/11. And understanding 9/11, what happened and the impact, how the world changed, you have to use both primary and secondary sources. All right, so you are going to do some practice here. All right. You are going to answer these questions in the Ed Puzzle, so I will stop in between them so that you can do so. All right, so practice. A book that was published in 1992 that you found in the library titled Columbus, The Complete Story of How a Town Became a City. Is this a primary source or a secondary source? It is a secondary source. So that book is a secondary source, and things that clue me in. It is the complete story of how the town became a city. And it was published in 92. So here's some things that hopefully we know. Columbus, the city of Columbus, is much older than 1992. We have been an established city in Ohio for well over 150 years. So I know that something written in 92, nearly like hundreds of years after we were first established as a city, is probably going to be a secondary source. But when something also says complete, that means the story is complete. It's done. We have been a city. And so that's going to tell me that this is a secondary source as well. Next one. All right. Pericles' funeral oration speech given to the people of Athens during the first year of the Peloponnesian War. Would that be a primary source or a secondary source? It is a primary source. So Pericles was a general from the golden age of Athens, around 431 BCE. So he gave a speech to the people of Athens during the first year of the Peloponnesian War, trying to kind of build them up. But this was written thousands of years ago, this speech. So it is a primary source. It was a speech that was given and then written down a few years after it was given by someone who was there. A Newsela article about Mansa Musa titled The Ancient Kingdoms of Mali Ruled by the Lion King, published in 2017. It is a secondary source. Anything that you're going to read for the most part on Newsela will be a secondary source. There can be primary sources on there, especially about current events, but typically primary sources will come from like the Library of Congress, other historical websites that now house primary sources online for us to look at. Newsela will typically always be a secondary source. So this is about the king of Mali from, I think Mansa Musa was like 700 or 800 in Africa. So again, this is over 1,000 years ago that he lived, but they wrote an article about him, about his life, about his impact in 2017. A piece of pottery found in the ancient ruins of Mycenae in Greece. It is a primary source. So pottery, ruins, architecture, things like that, that we often find when we do archaeological digs and excavate areas of the ancient world, we find them, they are primary sources. So the pottery would often depict what life was like in Mycenae, what role women played, what they believed in, what clothing they wore, things like that. So that is a primary source that we often use to help us understand their culture. All right, historical thinking. Asking good questions means thinking about context. It means trying to figure out what's important and why it's important. So we need to understand how change occurs and why change occurs. And asking, how did we get here? Why did it turn out this way instead of that way? These are all really important questions that we constantly need to be thinking about when we're looking at a source, when we are looking at a historical topic. And you're kind of always asking yourself, why did these things happen? And how would life be different if it hadn't happened? Okay, that's always in the back of your mind when studying history. So historical thinking is crucial and critical to being able to analyze history. And the way we do that is evaluating sources. So analysis and evaluation. Primary and secondary sources are crucial, but you have to sometimes determine which is going to be the better source to use. So even though they are excellent resources to use to understand historical perspectives, when you do research, you need to evaluate what the best source would be to help you answer the historical question that's being asked. So when you're looking at whether a source, you should use this source or that source, I want you to ask yourself, who is the author of the information? Is it someone who only observed one perspective of a multi faceted event? Or is it someone who is it a historian who is writing a scholarly article? Is it my Uncle Tommy who is writing the article on Wikipedia but has no certification in history? All of these are things that you need to look at. Like, maybe we don't go to Wikipedia and trust that without verifying it somewhere else. Wikipedia has become better over time, but we know that it is still not the best source to use for things. But also in today's day and age, it becomes very easy for us to get caught in the opinions that people want to publish online rather than the scholarly evidence. Okay, so we're going to look in a later lesson at how to identify fake news, how to identify source validity there. Right now, we're going to assume that both sources are valid. Both sources are good. Which one is the better one to use? So that is what you're going to practice. And the biggest thing you need to answer is, what is the historical question that I'm trying to answer? All right. So if I wanted to learn more about Aztec religion and sacrifice, which source would I use? Would I use source 1, Aztec paintings, or source 2, written accounts by Spanish conquistadors? Keep in mind, both are valid sources, and both are actually primary sources. But which one is going to be better to help me, a person living in 2020, whatever, to understand Aztec religion and Aztec sacrifice? So is it source 1, the Aztec paintings, or source 2, written accounts by Spanish conquistadors? Okay, source 2, this written accounts by the Spanish conquistadors. The reason for this being, why is this a better source? This is a better source because written accounts often give us more detailed information. It is someone's personal opinion, yes, and it is an outsider's opinion to Aztec religion and sacrifice. However, a painting is something that we would be interpreting, like now, using, if I just looked at the painting and nothing else, am I going to fully understand what their religion was, what their sacrifice was, how they practiced? No. So I need more information, and the written account by the conquistadors would give me that. The other thing you always want to remember with that, though, is that's obviously going to be full of bias because it is an outsider's perspective. So I'd probably still want another source. All right. If I wanted to learn more about life in the Roman Empire, which source would I use? A painting made in 1870, over 1,000 years after the end of the empire, by a European, or a history textbook made in 2006 by a group of American historians? Remember the questions to ask yourself. Who wrote it? When was it written? What is the historical question I'm trying to ask or answer? So the correct source here is source 2, the textbook. That painting was painted 1,000 years later by Europeans who idealized Rome. Okay, so it's how they imagine Rome to be, not something that they witnessed personally and painted. And it was one facet of Rome, a gladiator fight. That doesn't tell me about all of life in the Roman Empire. The empire was vast and expansive and had many different people and languages and cultures. And so, in order to fully understand that, I am going to want to use a secondary source in that case rather than the painting. If you wanted to learn more about the Arabian conquest of African kingdoms, which source would you use? A written account by the Arabians or oral accounts by the Africans? Now, this one is tricky. You would want to go with source one. However, that doesn't mean that you should discount source two. Source one is better in this case for the reason that written accounts tend to be a little bit more accurate, only because think about oral accounts. When you tell a story to your friends, do you tell it the exact same way every time? No. Okay, I have heard a story from, I'll use Miss O'Neill as my example. Miss O'Neill has this great story that she tells. It happened like 4 or 5 years ago. And I have heard that told to many different groups of people. But every time Miss O'Neill tells that story, it is slightly different. Not that she's lying, but she's like, oh my gosh, I totally forgot to mention this part of the story. Or she says it sometimes more detailed, sometimes less. I am guilty of doing the exact same thing depending on the story and depending on your audience. It doesn't mean anyone's lying. It doesn't mean it's not accurate. But when we retell orally, meaning we speak it, we tell the story, things change, and they change from person to person. If I were to tell the story, like I'm telling the story of what happened to Miss O'Neill, rather than Miss O'Neill telling it, I'm going to tell that story differently than she is. And so oral traditions are going to be less detailed, a little bit less accurate than a written account. But with this, you have to remember, we're also looking at it from two perspectives. I don't want just the Arabian perspective. I would also need the African perspective to really understand how the Arabian conquest of Africa impacted both the Arabians and the Africans, right? So in this case, source one is better, but I would want to make sure I found another perspective from the African side as well. If I wanted to learn more about how Columbus treated the native people, which source would I use? Would I use Columbus's presentation to Queen Isabella or his private journal? So source one or source two? I did not fix this. This should say source two. So ignore source one. The answer is source two. And the reason for that being, why would I want to use Columbus's personal journal? Do I think they're both Columbus's account of the event, right? Both are by Columbus. One is his presentation to Queen Isabella, but one is a private journal. Where is he going to be more honest? Is he going to be more honest in what was essentially his boss, because Queen Isabella is the one who funded it? Or is he going to be more honest in his personal account that he keeps for himself about what he actually did and how he actually treated them and what his thoughts and feelings were? He's going to be much more honest and accurate in that diary. And in fact, those diaries are why, from a lot of the explorers, we know that their treatment of the natives was oftentimes horrific and brutal. And it helps us gain a better understanding of what happened. We also look at native accounts of the conquistadors and of the explorers coming to new lands, because they're always going to present the sunnier side of things to the king and the queen, to the people, rather than how it actually was. And we don't want to see just the sunny side of history, right? We need to see all of it to understand how we got to where we are today, why things are the way they are today. All right, historic or common concepts in the practice of historical thinking. So cause and effect. Cause, what is cause? Cause is why something happened. A consequence or an effect is what resulted from the event that occurred. So oftentimes you'll look at, here was the cause, here was the effect. So the cause, World War I, I'm going to use an example. Even though we do not study it this year, but World War I, the main causes of World War I were militarism, the alliance system, imperialism, and nationalism, with a spark thrown in the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Those are the causes. But what happened as a result of rising nationalism across Europe, of imperialism throughout the world, of the militarization of many of the European nations, or the secret alliances that France, Germany, Serbia, Austria-Hungary, Russia all had with each other. The result of all of those is World War II. That's the consequence. What's the consequence of war? And that takes us down another path. What is the consequence of World War II? How did it impact our world? What resulted? How is the world different because of that? Okay. So rarely are things cut and dried and like one clearly leads to another and that's it. Everything kind of spirals, and we're going to have a cause and effect relationship throughout all of history. Significance is the other important one. You'll hear me use this word a lot, significance or impact. Sometimes we say enduring impact, but essentially this is, why was this event, this person, this place important? What would be different if this had not occurred? That's what you always want to ask yourself to find significance. How would the world be different if this had not happened? How would Rome have been different if Augustus had never turned it into an empire? How would Greece have been different if Athens had won the Peloponnesian War? How would ancient world have been different if Persia had defeated Greece in the Persian Wars? All of these lead us to why an event is significant, why we study it. Change is what is different over time. How have things changed? Okay, change is always, always, always occurring. We're going to look at how it happens, why it happens, but we also need to look at what exactly is different. And then continuity. What is similar and what has stayed the same? So are there certain things that throughout all of history are the same? Yes, absolutely. The way we interact with other humans, the patterns that exist throughout history, that is continuity. And you'll notice other examples of that as we study things that are the same in Greece, that were the same in Rome, that were the same in the British Empire even. So what you are going to do after this is you are going to practice some identification of primary and secondary sources, but also some evaluation of sources, some analysis. So you're going to receive 5 questions that look like this, and then some primary and secondary source identification. I'm going to do one with you, and then you'll do the rest on your own. So let's take a look at this. The historical question that is being asked: what was slavery like in South Carolina? Which source should I use? Which is more trustworthy? Is it source 1, an interview with a former slave in 1936? The interviewer is a Black man collecting oral histories for the Federal Writers Project. Or is it source 2, interview with a former slave in 1936? The interviewer is a white woman collecting oral histories for the Federal Writers Project. So which one do we trust more and why? So with this, the only thing that is different is who is doing the interviewing. A Black man interviewing a Black man, woman, anyone, former slave. We don't know if they're male or female, but what we do know is they are both Black. Or a white woman, and here it is important for the distinction that she is female, interviewing a Black man, woman, former slave. Why is it different? Even if it was a white woman interviewing a Black woman, the fact that she is a white woman means that her source is less trustworthy. And here's why. Not because she is going to lie, not because she is got prejudice and bias. None of that, actually. The reason you have to think is in 1936, it is important to remember that women did historically lead a more sheltered life. Okay, women were thought back then, which we know this isn't true today, right? But that they needed to be sheltered, that they shouldn't be told the harsh truths, that they couldn't handle some of the realities. Especially important to note is that a segregation still existed in 1936. So the likelihood of a white woman and a Black man or a Black woman being together and being able to talk honestly, for that former slave, whether it be man or woman, to feel comfortable telling a white woman what they experienced in slavery would have been unheard of. So they would not have felt comfortable enough to give her a true accounting of what had actually gone on and what had happened to them as slaves. However, they might have felt more comfortable and likely would have felt more comfortable talking to someone who shared the same race that they did, who was Black, who was a man, and not a woman who needed protecting. They would have felt more comfort in telling him a more accurate retelling of what they experienced throughout their life. So we're going to get more accurate information because they felt more comfortable with that interviewer. Think about it. If I want to get a story out of you guys, okay, and I want to know what happened, are you going to feel comfortable telling me, someone who, like, let's say you're having an issue with your friends and I want to know, like, who are you going to be more honest in your retelling with? Me, an authority figure, or one of your friends? Are you going to tell them more accurate truth of how a situation went down? Or think about even with your parents. Are you going to tell your parents everything, or are you more likely to tell your friends because you're more comfortable with your friends and they're more on your level? So that's what you want to think about when you're looking at these sources. Okay. So you would have said source one, and here's why. And you would say, I would trust this more because they would have felt more comfortable talking to a Black man. So he would have had a more accurate picture or more accurate information. 1 to 2 sentences. That's all you need to type. All right. So now you are going to put all of these historical thinking skills into practice. Good luck. If you have questions, please don't hesitate to reach out and let me know.